What's up guys, it's Eric from Rare Candy and I just got back from the World Championship held in Nashville, Tennessee, and today I'm going to be going over my top 8 tournament report from the event. I know uploads have been a little bit slow over the past week due to all of us being away at Worlds, but I figured this would be a nice way to get back into the swing of things here on the channel, especially since the event is still a bit fresh on my mind still. So if you guys didn't know, this was actually my first World Championship I've ever attended. Even though I've been playing off and on for what seems like forever at this point, this is only my second year I've actually committed going for a Worlds invite, with last year being my first and missing it by only I think around 15 or 20 championship points. So that was a bit of a bummer for me. So it felt great to actually secure my invite this season, and honestly just being invited to play alongside some of the best players the world has to offer was exciting enough for me. Now, of course, I wanted to do well at Worlds, but even if I went 0-3 drop at the event, I was still happy just to be able to share the same stage as so many great players in the community. So for the World Championship, the format was standard format, allowing cards all the way back from Breakthrough all the way up through the most recent set, Celestial Storm. So this did take place before the summer rotation, which means cards like Professor Sycamore and Puzzle of Time, etc. were still going to be legal for play at this event. As mentioned, Celestial Storm, in addition to the Psychic Tapu Lele promo as well, was freshly legal for this event, which of course was the huge new addition to the metagame. So with this being the first major event to allow these cards, at first glance that does make this type of event somewhat scary, because it means it's a blind metagame where no one has a very solid idea of what to expect. But luckily, the format really hadn't shifted in a significant way from what we saw at other recent major events prior to Celestial Storm. Now, of course, Rayquaza GX was the big new pillar that got added to the metagame, but most other decks we saw at the event were just established decks or refinements of those existing archetypes. As an example, the Zoroark control deck we saw Tordraklev popularize at the NAIC event integrated the new Magcargo, though it was still largely the same strategy, and similarly the new Shrine of Punishment helped see the emergence of a new Buzzwole Garbodor variant, but outside of that, the usual suspects were expected to show up, like Zoroark GX, Buzzwole, and Malamar, and with some other more fringe decks like Greninja and Gardevoir still being possible contenders. Now, Gardevoir GX in particular had some degree of hype going into this event, with the new addition of the Fairy Week Rayquaza GX into the meta, in addition to its generally even or kind of favorable matchups to everything else outside of Buzzrock. But overall, I didn't expect to see a massive shift from what we saw at the NAIC, other than maybe seeing Zoropod and Zoroark take a backseat to Zorogarb and Zoro Control as probably the most popular Zoroark GX variants. So with all this in mind, I had to begin thinking about what I wanted to play for this event. So like I mentioned, Gardevoir actually did have a little bit of hype going into this event, which I was actually ecstatic about. Gardevoir GX is honestly probably one of my favorite decks that we've had ever since it got printed. It's kind of my ideal playstyle. Of course, based on the name of the channel, I love rare candy-based decks and evolution decks, and those are generally my favorite points in the game's history, is when the format is very conducive to evolution-based decks, especially stage 2 decks that are attackers and not just, you know, bench sitters like Vikavolt or Magnezone, just as a couple examples. So the fact that Gardevoir GX, I think, did have a little bit more promise meant that I think it was a deck worth revisiting. So I actually did begin testing a bit with Gardevoir GX. But overall, I just was not quite convinced that the deck had what it takes to have a big showing at the World Championship. The first reason, of course, is that it is a Stage 2 deck. You inherently are going to be less consistent than your basic heavy decks like Buzzwole and Rayquaza variants, and you're also not as consistent as Zoroark variants because you don't have anything like trade built into your deck unless you're playing the Zoroark Gardevoir variant, but I've never really been a big fan of that deck. I always felt like it did a bad job at being a Zoroark deck and also a bad job at being a Gardevoir deck. I just never really enjoyed the archetype, so I was considering a more streamlined Gardevoir deck that was just Gardevoir GX, maybe an Octillery or an Oranguru or something like that, but closer to the quote-unquote broken Gardevoir style deck with a couple max potions, and like I said, Gardevoir is just your main attacker in the deck. But unfortunately, not much had changed from the past in terms of Gardevoir's Buzzwole matchup. Buzzwole has never really been a great matchup for Gardevoir to deal with, and it hasn't really gained much over the past couple sets to really change that at all, I think. And not even that, but the deck still just finds itself bricking from time to time. I do think generally Gardevoir is going to be favored against something like the Zoroark Garbodor variant or the Zoroark Control deck, but even still, sometimes I found myself losing still just because Gardevoir itself is a little bit inconsistent. And also at the World Championship, ties in particular were going to be very, very bad. It's basically the same thing as a loss at this event. And Gardevoir is a bit of a slower deck, especially once you factor in things like Twilight GX and Max Potions to deny knockouts. A lot of times your games go on for a very long time. So if you lose a long game one as an example, or even maybe lose a quick game one, sometimes it's very difficult to actually win two more games with the deck. And so that was one thing that really turned me off from playing Gardevoir. I would have loved to have played it at the event, but I just think the deck had a little bit too much going against it for it to be a good pick. The next deck I started testing with and was honestly my biggest contender for my pick to play at Worlds, probably for the longest time, and that was actually going to be Zoroark GX Banette GX. So Banette is probably one of my favorite cards that came out of Celestial Storm. Definitely go check out our set review, top 10 cards of Celestial Storm as well if you want to hear more about why I think Banette was so good. But I was really excited to have Banette back in the format. It is kind of a spiritual successor to the old Banette EX. But I think it really gave Zoroark GX a better shot against some of the fighting decks, which of course are usually its toughest matchups. So in the past, we've seen Zoroark decks play something like Mew EX or even the Mewtwo from Evolutions. But honestly, most of the psychic tech Pokemon that Zoroark has included are usually kind of bad cards. Yes, sometimes they can help you take a knockout or a return KO on one of these fighting Pokemon, but overall, they have a lot going against them. Mew EX in particular is a lot more powerful than Mewtwo, but it only has 120 HP and gives up 2 prizes. And especially if you look at something like the baby Buzzwole, which can hit for 120 if you knock out maybe their Buzzwole GX with your Mew. It can just be so easily return KO'd. Mewtwo also a much more situational attacker. It basically is only good if you have a choice band and your opponent has 3 energy on their Buzzwole GX. Other than that, it's kind of a mediocre attacker. You can't knock out a baby Buzzwole unless it has 3 energy as well. Now, of course, it does have 130 HP, which is actually pretty significant. Sometimes the extra 10 HP can help that Mewtwo tank a little bit more. But like I said, overall, it's a very situational attacker. And then Mew, like I said, is kind of a glass cannon and usually gets return KO'd unless it's like the card you use to take your last 2 prizes. So I've always just felt like these psychic attackers we have for Zoroark to make use of are kind of bad. And I think Banette GX is just such a better psychic attacker for Zoroark to deal with Buzzwole decks. So in my experience playing with Banette GX and Zoroark GX, I think it has a much better Buzzwole matchup than a lot of the other Zoroark variants do, which I think is something that can't be understated with how prevalent Buzzwole has been in the metagame. The particular list I was using actually was fairly similar to the one I initially posted on our channel. It was basically just like a Zoroark control deck, but with a 2-2 or like a 3-2 Banette line to deal with the Buzzwole matchup a little bit more. No mid-cargo or anything like that. Deck is basically built in a way to beat Buzzwole, and then all of the other spots are like heavy disruption cards to beat other Zoroark variants. But I ultimately decided against this deck for a few reasons. I did pretty bad at a league challenge the week before Worlds. I still think the deck was good, but I was honestly just, I think, a little on tilt afterwards. And I was just, I think, a little too nervous after that to take this to something like Worlds. That event just kind of put a bad taste in my mouth. And also, like I mentioned, ties are going to be pretty bad at the World Championship. I'm a bit of a slower player. I don't know if you guys have ever seen me play or played against me, but I'm not the fastest player, and Zoroark just has so many micro decisions to make. Sometimes for me, it's very difficult to actually play an entire series with Zoroark, much like in the case of Gardevoir, like I just mentioned. And also, too, there are so many micro decisions to make. I didn't have confidence that if I played it at Worlds, that I would play perfectly. You know, I'm going to be sharing the stage with so many other great players who are going to be less likely to misplay than maybe players at a League Cup, for example. So I thought I'd have much more opportunity to misplay with this deck, and also those misplays would be punished much more severely than maybe at a lower tier event against maybe some lesser skilled players. So ultimately, I was a little too scared, I think, to take this to the event. I think the deck was pretty solid for my testing, but like I said, I think for me personally, it would not have been a good choice. And probably I'd say a week before Worlds, another card I actually started testing very heavily was Mismagius, all the way back from the Crimson Invasion set. It has this attack Chaos Wheel for a single Psychic Energy, does 30 damage, and your opponent can't play tool cards, special energy, or stadiums from their hand on their next turn. So this is a card I actually started testing extremely heavily and was actually my #1 pick to take to the event for several days testing with this thing. The logic behind it was that you're psychic, so you hit things like Buzzwole for weakness, and also with the Baby Buzzwole Shrine of Punishment style deck that plays almost exclusively special energy in most cases, you auto win that matchup just with Chaos Wheel. So not only are you decent against both Buzzwole variants, but also if you look at the Zoroark control deck, it played exclusively special energy. And also if you look at the Zoroark Garbodor deck that won the North American International Championship, it played exclusively special energies as well. So the deck I was testing, it was Mismagius Garbodor with Shrine of Punishment. It has seen a little bit of play here and there, but it's never really been a big deck in the metagame or anything like that. But I felt like for the particular metagame that I was going to be walking into with Mismagius, in conjunction with the fact that we have Shrine of Punishment now, I felt like the deck was actually positioned a lot better than it previously was. Especially since Chaos Wheel locks in your Shrine of Punishment, it means your opponent can't actually bump the stadium unless they play something like Field Blower. And at the time, like I said, I was testing Mismagius Garbodor, so even if they play Field Blowers, guess what? They're adding to their item count, and Garbodor just was a great cleanup attacker, since Mismagius is kind of a weaker attacker. It's just there to kind of help you lock down the game and shut your opponent out of the game if they are playing one of these decks that I just outlined. But unfortunately, as with I think all of these Shrine of Punishment decks that I was testing, the big thing I ran into was consistency issues. You can't play several copies of Tapu Lele like most decks would. So there's a lot of times where you just have kind of a bad hand, and normally you could bail yourself out with an Ultra Ball or something like that, but the fact that it was a Shrine of Punishment based deck and also played the Garbotoxin Garbodor as well, it means you can't really actually afford to play these Leles, and you're going to have some games where you just have dead hands. So that was the first thing that made me start to think maybe this deck wasn't the greatest pick. But also after the North American International Championship, we started to see most of the Zoroark Garbodor decks start to favor basic psychic energies as kind of a response to the popularity of the Zoroark control deck, especially now that Magcargo is thrown into the mix. I think a lot of players started dropping their unit energies in favor of these basic psychic energies to make sure they weren't as vulnerable to enhanced hammer. So the fact that we started to see this shift in the metagame in the way that the deck that just won the North American International Championship was built scared me a little bit, because if a deck like that wins internationals, you have to expect to see it at Worlds. So I thought that was probably going to be the most popular deck at the event actually, and if most players were dropping their unit energies, I just could not rationalize playing Mismagius when they could just attach basic psychic energies and beat me that way. I even experimented with lists where I played 4 Crushing Hammer and Flare Grunts and things like that as well to deal with the more basic energy heavy decks, but no matter what I did, just wasn't quite enough. So even though Robin Schultz, who did go on to win the entire event with Zoroark Garbodor, was playing unit energies, I think most players were playing basic psychics, and I just, like I said, I could not take the risk of running into those types of decks. So this honestly all left me kind of scrambling last minute to find a deck that I wanted to play for this event. I think Zoroark Banette was kind of my fallback deck. That was the deck I definitely had the most hours of testing in with, and it's still a Zoroark deck at the end of the day. So I felt like the deck could just carry me to some degree if I do wind up playing it, but I still wasn't happy about picking it. So like I said, last minute I was kind of scrambling to figure out what I wanted to play. I knew I wanted a deck that would not go to time very frequently. I knew I wanted one that was consistent, and I knew I wanted a deck that didn't allow for a large room to misplay with. So I think that's something all of the decks I just outlined had some issues with. In the case of Gardevoir, is a deck that could easily go to time, and I could have ties. It's not the most consistent. Zoroark, on the other hand, is very consistent, but there's a much bigger window to potentially misplay with and sometimes tie due to how grindy some of these Zoroark mirror matches can be. And in the case of Mismagius, even though it was a straightforward deck that didn't allow me a whole lot of room to misplay, it just was not that consistent, and with how the metagame was trending for these Zoroark Garbodor decks, it just scared me off a little too much. So as I was looking through my options, I kind of realized there was one deck that I tested a little bit prior to when Celestial Storm released, and the more I started to think about it, it seemed like a better and better idea to run it at the event. And of course that ended up being Rayquaza GX. So like I mentioned, Rayquaza GX kind of hit all of the criteria I just outlined. It's a deck that was fast and consistent, so my deck is going to set up the same way most of the time. I'm not going to tie very often, and because it is kind of a straightforward strategy, there isn't a whole lot of wiggle room to really misplay a lot when you compare it to maybe a Zoroark variant, just as an example. So upon that, Rayquaza kind of came my front runner for the deck that I wanted to play, but within that there are certain different Rayquaza GX variants. But let's take a look at the list that I used and what I ultimately settled on for this event. So if we take a look at this list, just at a glance, it's pretty streamlined, guys. I didn't go too crazy with some of the other options I could have included. There's a number of different Rayquaza variants floating around. There's the like quote-unquote turbo style Rayquaza GX with acrobikes, and it's just super aggressive. There's like the Ultra Beast version where you play things like Xurkitree, Pheromosa, and Beast Rings to get extra energy on the field that way with some backup attackers. There's the Rayquaza Garbodor variant, which has the Garbotoxin Garbodor to shut off abilities as well. And then there's this one, which is just honestly just kind of a vanilla, streamlined, middle of the road Rayquaza GX deck. It's not relying on a lot of gimmicky tricks like the Ultra Beast or like Garbodor or anything. And also it's not overly aggressive and highly susceptible to Trashalanche as the more turbo style version of the deck is. I wanted just a nice streamlined version of Rayquaza to take. So let's take a look at the deck list. So of course Rayquaza GX, if you guys aren't too familiar with it, is the main attacker of the deck, has that Stormy Winds ability. Whenever you play this Pokemon from your hand onto your bench during your turn, you may discard the top 3 cards of your deck. If you do, attach a basic energy card from your discard pile to this Pokemon. Its attack Dragon Break for a Grass, Lightning, and Colorless is 30 times the amount of basic Grass and Lightning energy on this Pokemon, and its GX attack Tempest GX for a Grass energy. Discard your hand, draw 10 cards. So you can see the idea of the deck is just to kind of flood your board with energies. It's a very straightforward strategy, but it's highly effective, very fast, and powerful. I also did choose to play one copy of the Tapu Koko GX all the way back from Guardians Rising. Has that Air Trail ability. Whenever you bench it, you get to move it to your active and put any amount of lightning energy on your other Pokemon on Tapu Koko. And Tapu Koko is actually a pretty important card for a number of different reasons. So not only can you kind of throw it down out of nowhere and have an attacker ready to go, but the damage it hits for is very important for a few Pokemon that are floating around in the metagame. Its main attack, Sky High Claws for 2 lightning and a colorless, is 130. And even though that doesn't seem like a lot, especially when you compare it to something like what Rayquaza can hit for if you get enough energy on the field, it's an attack that you can set up very easily against the Baby Buzzwole Garbodor decks with the Shrine of Punishment. Whereas Rayquaza GX, you have to commit a lot of resources, whether it be max elixirs or discarding cards with Stormy Winds, which can sometimes be items, to get your Rayquaza set up. Tapu Koko GX is just a very low maintenance attacker that can knock out everything in that deck with committing very little items to the discard, like I already mentioned. And also, if I ever run into the Mirror Match or any other Rayquaza GX variants, Tapu Koko has a fantastic GX move for the same attack cost of 2 lightning and a colorless is 50 times the amount of energy your opponent has on the field. So sometimes you can throw it down, and even if your opponent is currently winning and maybe just knocked a lot of your energy off the board, sometimes if you just have enough to attack with a Tapu Koko, that alone can swing the matchup hugely back in your favor. So those 2 reasons in particular were the big ones I played the Koko GX. Now of course it is useful in other situations as well, also against Buzzwole decks because they play Max Elixir and Beast Ring and have a lot of energy on their field typically. So it's just good against a number of different decks. Latias Prism Star also pretty much a staple in the deck. Tapu Lele is pretty straightforward, but easily easily the best card in the entire deck, I would say, is the one copy of Marshadow, back from Shining Legends. So it has that ability to let loose whenever you play it from your hand onto your bench. Both players shuffle their hands into their deck and draw 4 cards. So this card is just so good for so many different reasons. So what I like doing most with this is playing on my first turn, especially if I go first. I'd like to kind of dig through my deck, do a bunch of Rayquaza stuff, getting a bunch of energy on the field, and then ending my turn by playing a Parallel City and playing a Marshadow to put my opponent at a 4-card hand instead of their 6-card hand they have after, benching or putting down their basic Pokemon. Sometimes this actually can just steal games, and I did this a couple times throughout my tournament run. Just getting that parallel Marshadow combo just won me a couple games just because it crippled my opponent's setup that much. But also there's a few other reasons why Marshadow is so good. So sometimes there are games where, man, it's like I want a Guzma and take out this important Pokemon, but I also really need to disrupt my opponent's hand. They just took a knockout and they have like an 8-card hand. And Marshadow is actually very good in this situation. I had a game in particular at one point where my opponent, they just took a knockout. They had a pretty thick hand, and I Guzma'd their Octillery, which was their last Octillery they had in their deck, and then played Marshadow in the same turn. So I took out their draw and also reduced their hand size at the same time. And there's a lot of different situations where I did a combo like this. And also Marshadow is just great because we don't have anything like Shaymin EX in the current format. So with this deck, a lot of times you're digging through your deck a lot, and Marshadow just gives you another out to hitting whatever you need. Like let's say you whiffed your max elixir that you needed to get your last energy on the field, but you have an extra bench spot. You can play that Marshadow and try to dig through your deck a little bit more to hit what you want. So like I said, absolutely the best card in the entire deck, and it seemed like a lot of other people really thought the same thing. This was kind of a card I really hadn't talked too much about, but I had been testing on and off with Rayquaza ever since the card got revealed. But everyone else kind of figured it out, and kind of my inspiration for this entire list was I just looked at the deck that won the Japanese Nationals like a month or so prior, and I literally just tried to adapt it to our standard format, and this is pretty much as close as you can get. So a couple of other key cards to go over here. 2 Parallel City, very good against other Rayquaza GX variants, so I'm going to have a little bit of favoritism in the mirror match. Also good against Zoroark variants to limit their bench size, and also good against Buzzwole Lycanroc. So not only to limit their bench size, but to limit mine as well. So since I was playing the Parallel Cities, it allows me to kind of have an aggressive early game where I get a bunch of Rayquazas on the field, maybe play my Marshadow, play a Lewa to get a supporter, and then parallel myself getting rid of some of these extra Pokemon to where Lycanroc GX can't take a big knockout with a dangerous Rogue GX, which I actually did a couple times throughout the tournament. I actually have a game that ended up being streamed. You can find it on YouTube. I'll try to put a link in the description where I did this exact thing to limit my own bench size to help deny knockouts ideally. And the other card of noteworthiness I want to point out here is going to be Fighting Fury Belt. So the tool card of choice for Rayquaza has been something I've seen a lot of people mess with. I think there's a lot of different schools of thought. I've seen people play Fighting Fury Belt, I've seen Wishful Baton, I've seen Choice Band, I've even seen some decks playing no tool cards at all, just opting for other other options in place of that. But ultimately I decided on Fighting Fury Belt. I was testing Wishful Baton as well prior to the event, but I played Fighting Fury Belt for a few reasons. One, I had a lot more games in with a list that had Fighting Fury Belt, so I felt just inherently more confident in that, but also it just makes the math so good against Buzzwole. Buzzwole, of course, one of the most popular decks that was going to be at the event, and sometimes the Fighting Fury Belt makes a big difference. So a baby Buzzwole has 130 HP, so guess what? That means if you have 4 energy in play, you're only hitting for 120, which means you're not taking a knockout. So that means with a Fighting Fury Belt, that extra 10 damage you get is going to make a difference. Similarly for Buzzwole GX, typically you would have to have 7 energy in play, but with a Fighting Fury Belt, all you need is 6. So it makes a really big difference at taking some of these key knockouts, and also kind of fills the same role that Wishful Baton does in terms of trying to preserve energy. So Fighting Fury Belt gives you 40 extra hit points, which means your Rayquazas can tank a little bit more, they can stay alive a little bit longer. And overall, I think this was most definitely the right call, especially with the amount of Buzzwole decks that I ran into throughout the course of this event. This also gave me an edge against some of the Baby Buzzwole Shrine of Punishment decks that were floating around as well. And just overall, this card just got so much value throughout my tournament run. Definitely happy I decided on this ultimately. But overall, guys, other than that, the list is really straightforward, just trying to get as much energy in play as quickly as possible. But let's head over to my matchups, and I'll take you through how my tournament run went. So for day one of the tournament, there was going to be 8 rounds in total, which means you had to go either 6-2 or 5-0-3 to make day 2 of the event. So for round 1, I got paired up against Zoroark GX Magcargo. This was definitely a matchup I felt pretty good about. A lot of times they do run the Sylveon EX as a way to help knock out your Rayquazas, but overall I'd say the matchup is favored, especially since I play Fighting Fury Belt instead of something like Wishful Baton. That is going to make it a little bit more difficult for my opponent to ever knock out my Rayquazas. It forces them to have just an extra combo piece like that Field Blower to get rid of my tool cards for their Sylveons to take a knockout. So I felt pretty good about this matchup going into round 1. However, my first game was really bad. I forget specifically what happened, but I just really couldn't get going. And I scooped pretty early on just to kind of conserve time and make sure we could complete 2 more games. And after that, I won 2 games back to back. I do forget the specifics, guys, but I do believe one of the games I did hit my opponent with the Parallel City Marsh Shadow combo. And I do remember my Parallel City really being a pain for them to overcome in one of the games in particular. So I was able to win 2-0 for the other games, which means I did win my first round, which felt really good. You know, walking into day 1 of Worlds, you see all these top players that you're familiar with seeing and hearing about, and you kind of know every opponent you have is going to be kind of a tough matchup. You are pretty much guaranteed a solid player no matter what. So it's a little intimidating at the beginning of the game, but it definitely felt good to start the day with a win and kind of put my mind at ease a little bit there. So round 2, I played against a Zoroark Garbodor deck, and I had to say, as soon as I saw my opponent flip over the Trubbish, I was a little bit sad, because this is definitely not one of this deck's more favored matchups, just because that Trash Avalanche Garbodor just does so much damage, since this is a very item-heavy deck. And also, sometimes with Stormy Winds, you end up discarding item cards that you don't want to. And so I just did not feel that good about the matchup. I've won it before in testing, but it's definitely favored for the Zoroark Garbodor player. However, I do remember my Parallel Cities just being super good against them. I think my opponent even mentioned something to me about it later or after the fact, how it was really just screwing up his ability to get set up. So Parallel City really putting in a ton of work during the series, and I believe I actually won 2-0. I do apologize for forgetting some of the specifics here, guys. I had a long 2 days. But yeah, I believe it came down to Parallel Cities and just being able to Guzma up Garbodors and things like that before my opponent could, really put on pressure of their own and take out knockouts with their Trash Avalanche Garbodor. So starting out 2-0 and just beat what I think to be kind of a bad matchup. Like I said, my Parallel Cities put in a ton of work there. I was able to time them at the right time to limit my opponent. So I think maybe I got a little lucky being able to squeak out the win here. But hey, I'm definitely okay with that. I don't know if I'm going to get lucky enough again to beat this deck again throughout the tournament. So I am happy with taking the win. So next up, going into round 3, I play against my first Buzzwole Lycanroc deck of the tournament. And I do remember in our first game, my opponent had a terrible start. I believe they just had kind of like a lone Buzzwole GX and just had to pass for a couple turns. And I was able to get set up pretty much going unchecked there. Had a ton of energy on the field, and it was just a pretty bad game for my opponent. Game 2, we did go to a game 2. I forget if my opponent won that one or not, but I did end up winning the series here. Maybe potentially lost game 2 and won game 3. I'm not sure. I kind of want to say I won 2-0 though in this series. But one thing of interest, my opponent did play Fighting Fury Belt, which was something I definitely did not expect. Typically Buzzwole decks tend to favor Choice Band, but Fighting Fury Belt definitely made it a little bit tougher to knock out some of these Pokemon. But nevertheless, it wasn't quite enough for my opponent to overcome my Rayquaza deck. So I am going to win round 3 again, starting out 3-0 at the World Championship. I have to say, guys, I feel really good. At this point, I can just win my next 2 ideally, and then ID my last 3 games into day 2 of the tournament. That's going to be best case scenario, I think, here. So next up in round 4, I'm playing against yet again another Buzzwole Lycanroc deck. And I had to say I felt pretty good after how my last series went, and especially like I mentioned too, I played the Fighting Fury Belts in here, I played the Parallel Cities, I have some ways to deal with Buzzwole, and I feel overall pretty confident about my matchup given the certain cards I play in my list. Unfortunately, though, things didn't go quite as well for me in this series. Me and my opponent, we played a very, very close game 1, but he eventually won that one. I believe I was going to win on my next turn. It was basically he had to win that turn, or otherwise I was going to win. I believe that's the situation that we had there. So I lost a pretty long game 1, won game 2, and then game 3 just did not have enough time to actually do anything. I think we got maybe 2 turns into our game 3 when time got called, and there was no way either of us could take 6 prizes in the amount of time remaining. So unfortunately, this series ended in a tie, which, like I mentioned earlier, a tie is almost as bad as a loss at this particular type of event. So I wasn't too excited about that, especially since I feel pretty confident about my Buzzwole matchup. But nevertheless, I'm still 3-0-1, technically undefeated for the day so far. I can literally just win 2 and then ID twice to get into day 2 of the tournament. So even though I did tie, it was a bit anticlimactic, I still feel okay. Going on to round 5, I play against another Buzzwole Lycanroc deck. I believe this was actually Riley Hulbert, if I remember correctly. Definitely no stranger to Buzzwole, as we've seen him play this plenty in the past too. But game 1 started out kind of awkward for me, if I remember correctly. I think I milled like 2 max elixirs with Stormy Winds, and I was just really struggling to get going, and I believe I scooped up game 1 pretty quickly to conserve time for the next 2 games. Both of the next games a lot closer, and I actually did misplay. I remember, I believe in our game 2, is it your game 2 or 3? But I remember I benched a Latias, and that put me at 3 Pokemon on my bench, which would allow a Lycanroc GX to Dangerous Rogue me for knockout. I do remember I Ultra Balled for the Latias, or Mysterious Treasured for it, just to thin it out of my deck before a Stormy Winds. I actually remember I wasn't even going to play it down, but I ended up just leaving it on my bench, I guess just not thinking about it. After I pulled it out of my deck, I set it down, and I guess I just forgot to actually put it in my hand. And so I had this extra Pokemon sitting on my bench, and it really came back to bite me because the next turn my opponent was able to actually Dangerous Rogue a Rayquaza GX on my bench. It wound up working out, but I just remember thinking, oh my god, this misplay is going to cost me this series, because otherwise my opponent would have just been able to Dangerous Rogue a Tapu Lele that was damaged with 0 energy, I believe it was. So I was thinking, man, if I just not benched this Latias, my opponent would have only been able to knock out this kind of worthless Pokemon, and I would be able to keep all of my energy and play with this other Rayquaza instead. But it wound up working out, guys. I forget any specifics beyond that, but I did wind up winning my next 2 games in the series, which means I am 4-0-1 at the World Championships. I'm starting to feel really excited because I don't know if you've watched any of my other tournament reports here on the channel, but I have a really bad habit of choking at these regionals and major events. I typically get literally 1 game away from day 2, and I lose like my last game of the day or something like that. So right now I'm feeling pretty good. I'm really just keeping my fingers crossed that I can win 1 more, and then I can just ID into day 2. Next up, however, I get paired against one of those Baby Buzzwole Garbodor Shrine of Punishment decks, and here's where my heart sinks a little bit because I'm expecting fully a loss in this matchup. It's definitely a winnable matchup, but it's most definitely not a favorable matchup because they're typically hitting for anywhere between 80 to 100 damage with their Baby Buzzwoles. Their Trash Range Garbodor is going to do a ton of damage in the late game. They also usually play the Garbotoxin Garbodor to shut off abilities as well. They play the Shrine of Punishments to get extra damage on the field. It's really just not a good matchup on paper. Typically, the only way I think Rayquaza beats this, or one of the outs I think Rayquaza has to beating this, is if they dead draw. But my opponent actually played the Oranguru and Octillery, so my outs to hoping that they dead draw a little bit lower than I guess maybe some of these other Buzzwole Shrine of Punishment decks. But anyways, going on to game 1, I don't believe it was a blowout, but my opponent did end up winning that one. I forget any specifics there. But in the early game, they trade 2-hit knockouts for 1-hit knockouts while only giving up 1 prize. So they have an even prize exchange for the first half of the game. Then the late game, they can start trading Garbodors with Rayquazas, which is where they pick up their last few prizes and pull ahead in the prize race. So they end up just kind of winning how you'd expect in Game 1. Game 2, however, I did win. I forget, yet again, some specifics about these games, but I did wind up somehow winning a very close game in our Game 2. And then Game 3, we unfortunately did not have enough time to complete. So this is going to be a tie. And I gotta say, I'm actually pretty happy about that, because had I lost this game, I actually wouldn't have the option to potentially ID into day 2 of the tournament. Had I lost this one, I'd have to win my next 2 games to be able to make it. So this actually allowed me another out to potentially make day 2 of the tournament. The next round, I get paired against my first Rayquaza GX deck of the day. And it looked like, from what I could tell from his list, it was more of a turbo style one where he played a lot of acrobikes and additional forms of draw power like Oranguru as well, I think, that to make his deck just a little bit more aggressive than mine. Also played things like the Wishful Batons to try to preserve their energy in play as well. In Game 1, I remember my opponent had a pretty solid start, and they were just always a little bit ahead of me, and I wound up, I think, scooping that one pretty early, or maybe even like halfway through the game, I think, or maybe they actually won the game outright, but I do remember the first game just not going very well for me here. However, games 2 and 3 is where I did bring it back. I forget specifically what happened in each game, but I remember I had one turn in particular where my opponent had I think it was only like 2 energy in play, but they had 3 energy and a Wishful Baton on their active Rayquaza, and I was able to Field Blower that and take a knockout and deny them their energy that they needed to actually close out the game and take their last knockout, I believe it was. Fighting Fury Belt's also putting in good work in this matchup as well. It allows my Rayquazas to tank a little bit more. It forces my opponent to have 8 energy into play with their deck, which for Rayquaza isn't too hard to pull off, but I'd say typically in my experience, 6 is usually the magic number where my energy usually is, 6 to 7. Any more than that winds up being a little bit difficult sometimes. So just having the Fighting Fury Belts, being able to deny those Wishful Batons with the Field Blower, also just put things in my favor, and I was able to win this one pretty closely. And I gotta say, guys, I am on top of the world at this point. I have a huge weight lifted off my shoulders, because now I'm 502. I can actually just safely ID into day 2 of the tournament. And I remember everyone, or all my friends that I was with, was so excited for me, but I remember being pretty pessimistic because, like I said, I had a history of choking at these events and, losing like my last game of the day or something to keep me out of day 2. And as long as I don't get down paired to an opponent that has to actually play out their next game, maybe my next round opponent can just ID and just instantly guarantee day 2 of the tournament. And that's actually exactly what happened. My next round opponent, I forget his record, but I believe he was 502 as well, or something similar to that. And we just shook hands and we were able to ID. And that means I made day 2 of the World Championships with Rayquaza GX. And guys, I have to actually say something too. I remember I was telling some of my friends I was with, like, I want to do well, but I was just happy to be there. Even if I went 0-3 drop, I would be completely happy, just happy to be at the World Championships with a lot of my friends, and just having the honor to play against so many great players was enough for me, and I had pretty low expectations going into the day. Just, whatever happens, happens, and I'm not going to be too upset no matter what it is. And so the fact that I kind of went in with this apathetic attitude and got day 2 was just amazing for me. I was so excited, especially since this is actually my first day 2 of an event ever. I historically, like I said, always choke when it comes to making day 2 at tournaments. So I was just so happy to get over the day 2 hump and not only do it at a major event, but it be the World Championship of all events to potentially make day 2 at. So just so happy with how this day turned out. So before I get too deep into my specific matchups on day 2 of the event, just want to point out the World Championship, they do allow you to actually change decks between days 1 and 2. So if I decided to want to play something different, I could. And I remember looking at some of the results for the decks that did make day 2. There was a lot of the Baby Buzzwole Shrine of Punishment decks that were running around or saw success on day 1 of the tournament, which actually had me kind of scared because, like I mentioned, that is not a very good matchup for my deck. So last minute, I actually started thinking about should I actually bust out the old Miss Magius again and try to maybe counter the metagame of day two of the tournament. But ultimately, I decided to just play it safe. I kind of went in day one with an apathetic attitude. Just, I'm just going to play Rayquaza. I'm going to go fast, hit stuff hard. If I win, I win. If I lose, whatever. That's kind of what I did for day two. I've sleeved up literally just the same 60 cards. It did well day one, so we're just going to see how it's going to go on day two. So for round one of day two, I play against Lucario GX, Lycanroc GX. So this is definitely a deck I was not prepared to run into, but I think on paper my deck is definitely favored against them. Just because Lucario GX, it's usually going to hit for 120 base damage, 150 with a Choice Band, then 170 with a Diancie Prism Star, and then if they have the strong energy as well, it's going to be a 190. But I played the Fighting Fury Belt, so my Rayquazas can tank a little bit more and survive an Aura Strike. And also, since I'm usually taking one-hit knockouts as well, they can't make use of Cantankerous Beatdown GX. And they also don't play things like Max Elixir, so it's kind of hard for them to even, get a Lycanroc GX powered up quickly out of nowhere in one turn as well. So I feel like on paper I have an advantage, but both of our games were very, very close. I remember both of them came down to like the last turn where basically my opponent needed to have game, otherwise I had it, that type of thing. And I believe this was actually one of the series that I mentioned earlier where I did a play where my opponent had, I think they had already gotten rid of their Remoraid, or I already knocked out one Remoraid or something like that, and then mid-game I Guzma'd their Octillery and played Marshadow to also reduce their hand size while eliminating their source of draw power from the field. I believe this was the series where I pulled off that combo. But like I said, two very, very close games. This wound up being a lot closer than I actually expected it to be, but I wound up pulling it out and winning my first round of day two of the tournament here. So next round, I'm playing against yet again another Buzzwole GX deck, another Buzzwole Lycanroc deck. At this point, I'm pretty comfortable with the matchup, kind of know what I need to do. Try not to bench excessive Rayquazas in the early game to play around Dangerous Rogue. Make sure that you're fighting Fury Belts. Get down, wait for your opponent to fill their bench after a couple Brookwood Hills and then parallel them, making them get rid of important cards, sometimes like a Diancie or like an extra Rockruff or something like that. That's kind of the strategy for Rayquaza to take down this Buzzwole deck. And I remember I had kind of an awkward time at one point in the series. I hit my opponent with the first turn Marshadow, putting them down to like nothing, and I remember they had pretty much nothing. I think they just attached pass for a couple turns, and I had an N in hand, and I was forced to kind of just stick it out and not actually play the N because my opponent, they had kind of a bad start after the Marshadow. The Marshadow did what it needed to do, but unfortunately I just didn't draw a supporter or a way to get a supporter that was not an N. So one of our games was a little bit slow, but ultimately I end up winning them. I forget any crucial pivotal moments in this series that we played, but I ultimately did wind up winning this one in a pretty convincing 2-0, I believe it was, if I remember correctly. Round 3, however, is when things get a little bit scary. So I get paired up against Xander Perot playing Banette GX Garbodor. I did have a friend tip me off. Apparently, Banette Garbodor was a deck that a lot of players brought into day 2 of the tournament. Maybe seeing that Zoroark didn't do quite as well as they expected. Maybe is what I'm thinking. So they shifted gears and decided to sleeve up Banette. And yeah, so I was actually pretty scared for this matchup because they play the Trashlanch Garbodor, which any deck that plays Trashlanch Garbodor is going to be pretty bad for Rayquaza GX. And I do remember, I believe our game 1 was actually very, very close here. And I remember I tried to Sycamore or something to hit the Field Blower I needed to make sure their Banette couldn't knock out my Tapu Lele on the bench. I whiffed the Field Blower, and my opponent was able to Guzma knock out my Lele for game when I had game in hand next game. So it actually wound up being a very, very close game despite, the Trashlanch. I did remember I had a play where my opponent did have a lot of energy on the field. I think they had like 2 double colorless energies and a rainbow energy, and I was able to throw down Tapu Koko GX and actually use Tapu Thunder GX to knock out, I believe, a fresh Banette GX. So even though they're playing a deck that doesn't rely on a lot of energy to attack with, they, I guess, maybe forgot about Tapu Koko or just maybe didn't know that I played it, and that allowed me to take, kind of a big surprise knockout one game. But game two, my opponent didn't have much going. I think I maybe hit him with a turn one Marshadow Parallel or something like that. And I remember they just had kind of a bad setup. They were really struggling to get going. So we scooped up, go to game three, and I wound up winning that one as well, miraculously. Like I said, I'm not expecting to win against any deck that plays the Trash Ranch Carbutter, but I was able to end up winning this one. And, I feel like I overcame kind of a bad matchup that probably should be a loss for my deck, but I also do think I have a little bit of an advantage over other Rayquaza decks because I don't play things like Acrobike or Beast Ring or some of these extra item cards that some of the other Rayquaza players might be favoring in their lists. So round 4, I am playing against, yet again, another Buzzwole GX Lycanroc GX deck. And actually, too, guys, if you want to see this entire game, I will have a link down below in the description. This game was streamed on Pokemon's Twitch channel and is uploaded on YouTube now. So definitely go check out if you want to see how this game pans out more specifically. But I felt really good about this one. I was a little bit nervous going on the official stream, even despite being recorded for the channel all the time. It's a little bit intimidating playing on that stage, having all those lights on you and everyone watching. But I wound up winning game one kind of as expected. I feel, like I said, pretty confident about my matchup against this deck. Going into game two, I remember I had a crucial misplay that I think probably costed me the game. I remember I had a Lightning Energy, a Grass Energy, and a Fighting Fury Belt on my active Rayquaza GX. And then I had a Benched Rayquaza with, I believe, 2 Energy as well. And my opponent had a Baby Buzzwole in the active spot. And I go to attach an energy, and I attach to my benched Rayquaza GX, not realizing that the Fighting Fury Belt that I had on my active Ray was a Fighting Fury Belt. I thought it was an energy just at a glance, and so I attached to my benched one, and I immediately realized, oh wait, I don't even have energy to attack because I thought my tool card was an energy. And after that, my opponent was able to knock out my Rayquaza, and I was not able to get a prize or anything in the process because of that, and it just set me behind. And I believe I actually end up losing that game by just a single prize card. So unfortunately, I wound up losing game two. It was still actually really close despite that huge misplay. I was one turn away from winning, but my opponent had their the energy and the Guzma they needed to take a knockout on, I think, like a damaged Tapu Lele for game with their Lycanroc GX. So I felt terrible about that, guys, because, like I said, I feel confident in my matchup, and I was going to be able to take a knockout that turn had I just attached to the active like I was supposed to. But, so we go to game three, but unfortunately, I think on, like, turn 2, time gets called. Neither of us have taken any prizes, so it's going to be impossible for us to actually conclude the series. So this does result in a tie. So I was a little bit upset with myself here for misplaying there, not attaching to the right Pokemon. And like I said, too, guys, if you want to see this series, it's actually a really fun series to watch. It's pretty back and forth. I will have a link below in the description if you guys want to watch this one. But even though we tied, I still feel pretty good. There's only going to be 7 rounds of day 2. If I win my next 2, I can literally just ID and get into top 8 of the tournament, which is a crazy thought. Not something I was really considering, but I really just wanted to make top 32. I believe I had to be 411 or better. Top 32, I believe, was going to walk away with $1,500, something like that. So as long as I could walk away with some money, I was going to be happy. Didn't really care if I made top 8. Of course, I want to, but it really wasn't my big priority, I guess. So up next, I checked the pairings for round 5, and I realized I am paired up against Takuya Yoneda, one of the best players in the entire world from Japan, who actually just won Japan's recent national championships with Rayquaza GX. Literally, when I was building this, I just looked at the Japanese list that won Japanese nationals, and I tried my best to adapt that to our standard format. So if anyone knows the deck that I'm playing and knows how to play against it and play with it, it's going to be Yoneda. So it was a huge honor, honestly, just to play against the guy. It's a guy who's a very big name overseas. I was excited to finally play against someone from Japan, or not from my country. Most of my players that I've run into have been from the United States. I did play against, I think, someone from Denmark at one point, also I believe from Poland, but overall most of the players I had run into had been predominantly US players. So it was exciting to play against someone else from a different country. So I knew he was playing the Zoroark Gallade deck. It was kind of like the Zoroark control deck that my Cargo players have been using, but using Gallade instead of Mag Cargo, since they function kind of similarly in their role in the deck, but Gallade is also a good attacker against other Zoroark variants. And I have to say, I won this one actually very convincingly. Game 1 was a complete blowout. I end up going first. I end up digging through my deck, doing Rayquaza stuff. I wound up with I think 5 energy on the board on my first turn and ended with a Parallel City Marshadow, which was so devastating. My opponent, I think, just benched a couple Pokemon, including a Sylveon EX, and just passed. So after that, I Guzma'd Sylveon with a Fighting Fury Belt on my Rayquaza, attached an energy, and was able to knock out their Sylveon EX. And even if they have a way to get it back on the field, they would need a Choice Band, double Carlos energy, and a Field Blower to get rid of my Fighting Fury Belt. And I was able to just knock down everything Yoneda had for the rest of the game. And a game 1, like I said, very, very convincing game. So he scoops up, we go to game 2. This one, however, was a little bit closer. Definitely, I was still the one putting on the most pressure for the majority of the game. I had, yet again, a very solid start. And throughout the game, he was putting a bunch of energy on Tapu Lele. At one point, he actually had 3 energy on a Lele and Guzma'd up a Rayquaza I had, knocked it out, and his 4th double Colorless energy was actually already discarded. So it was the type of thing where if I, with the return KO, Yoneda could potentially just roll over me from there. So basically he was putting me in a situation where it's like, hey, you basically have to have this return KO, otherwise I'm just going to Guzma kill everything you have and then just win. But luckily I was able to get the return KO on the Tapu Lele and got a Fighting Fury Belt down in the process as well. However, Yoneda was actually still playing it very well. Even though all of his energy was gone, he had access potentially to a play that could win him the game. So he had a Gallade that he promoted after I knocked out that Lele with 3 energy, and he played a Professor Kukui. And if he had gotten a Choice Band in the process and a double Colorless energy, maybe thanks to some puzzles of time, he actually could have knocked out my active Rayquaza GX. And oh yeah, he also would have needed a Field Blower, of course, to remove my Fighting Fury Belt. So if he had gotten that combo, he would have actually, I think, won the game. I think that would have been his last 2 prizes. Or even if that wasn't his last 2 prizes, I was almost out of energy at that point in the game, and I would not have been able to actually set up enough energy to take a return KO on a GX or EX on the next turn. So unfortunately, though, he did whiff the combo. Like I said, he had already gone through all 4 double Colorless energies. He would have needed just so much, and he just could not get all of the pieces together to make the play happen. And I wind up ending the series 2-0 against this Zoroark Gallade deck. So I'm on fire, guys. Like I said, I feel like I'm on top of the world right now. I'm at the point where even if I lose my next 2 rounds, I still walk away with some money. So I'm happy with how my entire tournament run has gone. Whatever happens at this point is literally just gravy on top of everything for me. So up next in round 6, I'm getting paired against another Buzzwole Garbodor deck. And as soon as I saw who my opponent was, I knew I was going to be in for a hard time because I saw them picking up their cards earlier in the day and they were playing this Shrine deck. And I remember specifically thinking, okay, I just need to dodge that guy and everyone else playing that deck. And then I get paired up against him. I believe his name was Alessandro Cremascoli. It was an Italian player. I do apologize if I butchered your name, Alessandro, but super nice guy. This was definitely a big game for both of us. If either of us win this one, we can just ID our last one to get into top 8. But even despite how high pressure this game was, definitely a super friendly player throughout the entire thing. So I gotta say, I am very sad that I had to run into this deck yet again. And I have to admit, I do forget how game 1 went, but I somehow miraculously wound up winning it. I think my opponent maybe sycamored for something and whiffed what they needed for a knockout, or something like that, and I was able to win a very, very close game 1. Game 2, however, I do remember being a little bit more interesting, and this is actually a really good game that highlights, I think, how to play against this type of deck with Rayquaza. So a lot of times when I would bench Rayquaza, I wouldn't even use Stormy Winds. I would try to set up a Latias play to accelerate all of my energy that way, as opposed to discarding cards with my ability. And then also, this is another instance where it really just shows off how good Tapu Koko GX is against this deck. I was able to actually get Tapu Koko GX into play, I think, on turn 2, with only having 4 or 5 items in the discard at that point. So I was able to just knock out anything my opponent had with Sky High Claws. while in the process not being able to be one-shotted by a Garbodor with Trash Lanch. And so even though I had things in my hand I could play, like I remember I had a Pal Pad I was sitting on at one point, a Mysterious Treasure, I think even at one point I think I had a Max Elixir in hand. I opted just not to play because I did not want to play into Garbodor. I wanted to be able to just keep streaming these knockouts, ideally 2 to 3 knockouts with this Tapu Koko before I have to shift gears and start attacking with Rayquazas. And so I was able to do that, like I said, just by taking knockouts while also not putting items in the discard. And I wound up actually winning this series 2-0. I could not believe it. Now, I will say this, my opponent, unlike on day one, did not play an Octillery. He did play a Ringaroo in his list, but he did not play anything like Octillery, which means a lot of times he was digging for things that he wanted to hit. Like I remember he was trying to hit a Shrine of Punishment one game to, you know, take a knockout with, and he ended up whiffing that. Had he had something like Octillery or something, an additional way to dig, I might have been in a little bit more trouble, especially since I had one game where I end him to 1, and he had an Oranguru, which is something, but it's not as powerful as Octillery when it comes to closing out games. So I think just the combination of him only playing the Oranguru, unlike my day one opponent, and by just trying not to play unnecessary items and leading with Tapu Koko really helped me wrap up this game, and I was able to win 2-0. Like I said, 5-0-1. All I have to do is ID my next round. I can literally even lose my last game of the day, and I'm guaranteed top 8 at the World Championships. I can't get over this. And as expected, my next round opponent did want to ID. I believe it was Shuto Itagaki. He was also playing a Rayquaza GX deck, who also made it into top 8. And like I said, I'm just so ecstatic at this point. I finally got over the day 2 hump I had been, constantly failing to get over the past season or so. And not only doing it at the World Championship, but also making top 8 of the World Championship. Honestly, with a deck that I didn't even have that much confidence in. Rayquaza, I thought it was a solid archetype, but I felt like there's a lot of decks that had good matchups against it. I didn't think it had really any fantastic matchups. It just kind of had 50-50-ish across the board, other than maybe something like Greninja, where you just kind of outspeed them. I was just thinking, hey, it's a consistent deck. It's not going to tie that often, so it'll be a good pick for me. But here we are, making top 8 of the World Championships with Rayquaza GX. And looking at the top 8, there's actually a couple decks in particular that I wanted to run into. But ultimately for top 8, I get paired up against Pedro Torres, who is also playing Rayquaza GX. Now, I did find out prior to our top 8 match, he's playing some interesting cards that I was not. He was playing an extremely aggressive version of Rayquaza GX. So I think literally the only supporters he played in his entire deck were 4 Professor Sycamore and 1 Lily. He did not play any ends that I could see. I don't remember any Cynthias. I think from what I remember, it was literally just 4 Sycamore, 1 Lily, but he played 4 Acrobike and 4 Puzzle of Time as well. So he could just dig through his deck over and over and over with Acrobikes and supporters. He played 2 Marshadow as well, if I remember correctly. At least 1, but I think it was 2, if my memory serves me correct. So he had all these non-supporter ways to dig through their deck, and with Puzzles of Time, they could actually grab Acrobikes again to keep digging, or they could get, more importantly, Max Elixirs to keep energy onto the field. So I have to say, I was a little bit intimidated, but I did find out there was a bunch of people playing Jolteon EX in their Rayquaza GX lists, and I was also just relieved to find out he was not one of those people. So I was like, you know what, I'll take anything else, I guess. As long as he's not playing Jolteon EX, I think I have a chance. So game 1, I forget the specifics of it, but it was a very, very back and forth game, but I wound up narrowly winning that one. Thanks to Tapu Koko GX, if I remember correctly. So I have to say, guys, I feel really good. Right now, I've already made top 8, so I feel good, but I'm literally just 1 game away from top 4 of the World Championship. And top 4 specifically is very important. If you make top 8, you get $5,000 prize money, but if you get top 4, I believe it's $7,500. And more importantly, I think you get a guaranteed invitation to the World Championship for next year. So literally, I'm just 1 game away from making it to Worlds again. And so a lot of pressure on this next game. And game 2, my opponent opens with a Rayquaza GX, attaches and just passes. And so I am absolutely ecstatic about this. This is such a huge chance for me to just take an easy win and go on the top 4 of the tournament. So my first turn, I prioritize getting Lightning Energy into play. That way I can get Tapu Koko GX to do a guaranteed 130. So I was able to do that. I max Elixir'd a Lightning Energy, a Stormy Winds the Lightning Energy, and then attached one, and used Tapu Koko with a Fighting Fury Belt on it to do 140. And basically just had to tell my opponent, hey, you have to have something this turn, otherwise I win. And I don't know what my opponent drew. It might have been an Ultra Ball or something, but he went off. He went from having a dead hand to knocking out a completely full health Fighting Fury Bell Tapu Koko GX in one turn. I could not believe it. And even prior to my taking their second turn, I was thinking, okay, even if he draws out of this, it's fine. This Tapu Koko is still going to survive and get me 2 prizes either way. So it's going to be okay. But the fact that my opponent had such an incredible turn, going from 0 to, having absolutely nothing to having everything, having so much to knock out this clean Tapu Koko with a Fighting Fury Belt, was just absolutely huge, and was such a huge tempo swing back in his favor after that. However, it was still a very, very close game for the rest of the game, and basically I had Guzma in hand ready to take game 2, and my opponent just needed a Field Blower to clear off my Fury Belt to take a knockout. They had already gone through all of their puzzles of time. They had already played one Field Blower. They had one left in deck, and they were able to Oranguru for the single Field Blower left in their deck to knock out one of my Pokemon, narrowly taking game 2. And I have to say, I was so heartbroken after this game just because my opponent had such a bad start and went from 0 to 100 just out of nowhere. And then also hit the one single Field Blower that they had left in deck too. It was just so heartbreaking that they hit these crucial things on these certain turns. But we still have another game. But game 3 goes absolutely terribly. So I forget what turns all of this occurs on, but I end up failing a Max Elixir very early on, and then using Stormy Winds, I actually discarded 2 more Max Elixirs. And that's just so big in this mirror match in particular, because my opponent not only has 4 Max Elixirs of their own, but they play Puzzles of Time, so they can reuse their Max Elixirs to keep energy in play over and over and over. So really what I'm thinking from here is, okay, well, I'm not going to be able to keep energy in play as efficiently as my opponent can. So what I need to do is make sure that I can use Tapu Koko GX with minimal energy in play to take a big one-hit knockout at some point, because Tapu Koko, I only need 3 energy on him. I don't need a crazy amount of energy on the entire field like in the case of Rayquaza. Just need 3 energy and I can take a big Tapu Thunder GX knockout to keep myself in the game. But unfortunately, my opponent plays a Marshadow and gives me an absolutely terrible hand. It was so bad, and I was forced to just Guzma something and use Tempest GX to draw back into the game, which eliminated my chance of using Tapu Thunder ever throughout the course of the game. So once that happened, I kind of knew that the game was over. But it was one of those things where I had to use Tempest GX because I had nothing in my hand. I couldn't just sit back while my opponent, keeps popping off and does all of their crazy speed stuff that they're doing. I had to get back into the game to some degree, but unfortunately after that, guys, it was just such a lost cause. Like I said, I already milled away 2 elixirs. I had 1 not work. I can't use Tapu Thunder GX, and after that, my opponent, to be fair, did have a couple of challenges. Some of his max elixirs weren't working, but his deck was just so much better positioned than mine after that I was always just too far behind to ever make a comeback. And unfortunately, I lose game 3 in the series, which is going to knock me out of the tournament and prevent me from moving on to top 4 of the World Championship. So guys, I do have to admit, I am a little bit sad about that. That game 2 in our top cut matches there was just so bad. I kind of felt like that one got stolen from me a little bit there, but nothing against my opponent. He was actually super nice. We actually had a good time going back and forth chatting throughout the event. And that's actually one thing I just want to give a shout out to a lot of my opponents for. This is, the biggest tournament of the year. The stakes are, they're never higher than at the World Championship. So I just had a lot of really awesome opponents, a lot of really friendly people throughout this tournament, including Pedro in that top 8 match. So if nothing else, Pedro, if you're watching this, good games, man. Really had a lot of fun playing that series. And overall, guys, I'm just kind of blown away about how this tournament went for me. I went in with very low expectations and wound up doing way better than I would have ever imagined at my first World Championship. So as for what performed well for the rest of the day, let's take a look at the rest of the top 8 decks. So coming in at 8th is Zoroark GX, At 7th was a Rayquaza GX deck. At 6th was Buzzwole Lycanroc. At 5th was myself, of course, with Rayquaza GX. Number 4 was Pedro, my top 8 opponent, playing that Turbo style Rayquaza GX deck. At 3rd, we had Zygarde GX, Lycanroc GX, a deck I think no one saw coming to potentially make it into top 4 of this tournament. At number 2, we had an interesting Malamar deck, and at 1, we had Robin Schultz playing Zoroark Garbodor. So this world's top 8 actually pretty nice. I like the fact that there is a bit of variety. We have some Zoroark in there, we have Malamar, we have Buzzwole, Rayquaza, we even have a Zygarde GX deck in the mix as well. So I'm really happy with this top 8, not only for myself, but like I said, just in general, really glad that there was a diverse mix of decks that made it into the top 8 of the World Championships. So overall though, guys, I had a great time at the World Championships, not just in terms of my own performance, but just in general. I thought the weekend was so great. A couple things that happened at this tournament. During the opening ceremony, we got the new tag team Pokemon GX revealed for the first time, which was very exciting. There's also a part during the opening ceremony where some of the people working on the Detective Pikachu movie came out, and we actually got to record lines of dialogue for the movie. There's going to be apparently a fight scene in the movie, so we got to record some bits of dialogue where everyone in the crowd is chanting and saying certain things like critical hit and things of that nature. So that was a really awesome experience. The fact that I'm gonna have like some little bit of dialogue in a movie next year. So I just felt like that was so cool. There was also a Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee demo on site as well. I was able to actually get in a little bit of time with that on the last day of the World Championship. After I got knocked out of top 8, the next day I went to watch the finals, all that stuff, and hopefully play some Let's Go. So I got some hands-on time with that. Myself, Xander, and Kenneth from Rare Candy, none of us live in the same area, and we see each other at regionals and things like that. But it was awesome to finally have all of us in the same room again and be able to hang out a little bit. And not only that, but just see everyone else from the Carolinas there to play alongside me at the World Championship and be there to root me on in day 2 and Top Cut. It meant a lot to have the support from everyone there rooting me on in day 2 of the tournament. And of course, too, just want to say congrats yet again to everyone else who made top 8. And also, too, just a big thanks to all my opponents for being super friendly at an event like this that was such high stakes. Really awesome to always run into nice people that are fun to play with. But yeah, guys, that's going to pretty much wrap up my World Championship tournament report. As far as what's on the horizon, of course, we have the rotation going into effect and the new season is kicking off. So definitely stay tuned to the channel as we're going to be starting to look ahead now to the post-rotation format. And of course, Dragon Majesty also on the horizon as well. But as usual, guys, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you can support this channel by becoming a patron over at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or by picking up something from our online store at rarecandytcg.com, it would mean a lot. But with that, I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time.